Zirconium errors and hazards in the nuclear industry.
Part 4. The MOX project and grade school geometry errors. The tip of one iceberg contributing to a Titanic success. While this section, Part 4, was prepared for those without specialized backgrounds, the following material does presume familiarity with NRC and industry misunderstandings of zirconium cladding degradation, failures, and control rod issues described in Parts 1 to 3.
Please note, you don't need to follow all of the details. Errors and problems appear simpler and more obvious later. Significant zirconium deformations appear to have contributed to technical problems that added to the difficulties of U.S. attempts to meet obligations of the Plutonium Management and Disposition Agreement. According to the U.S. State Department, the U.S. and Russia would dispose of weapons-grade plutonium, thereby preventing the plutonium from ever being used for weapons. The U.S. planned to meet its obligations to dispose of at least 34 tons of this plutonium, enough to produce 17,000 nuclear weapons, by processing the plutonium into mixed oxide fuel, that is, MOX, and use it as fuel in civil power reactors to produce electricity. Plutonium fission in MOX fuel creates greater numbers of fast neutrons, creating core conditions in reactors fueled with MOX that, in some respects, are more demanding than conditions found in reactors using conventional uranium oxide fuel. MOX fuel qualification was required early in the MOX project to determine if AREVA MOX fuel rod and fuel assembly designs would work properly in U.S. commercial reactors. MOX qualification was to be conducted in Duke Energy's Catawba reactor. As described in the fuel qualification plan, the MOX fuel cladding and fuel assembly designs were reviewed and approved by the NRC. The NRC also approved accident modeling computer codes. This NRC memo describes many concerns about MOX fuel use in commercial reactors, stating, MOX fuel will affect the analysis of loss of coolant accidents. MOX fuel may affect fuel behavior during reactivity accidents, especially at high burnups. Fuel behavior during a loss of coolant accident is determined almost entirely by the cladding. The increased energy released per plutonium fission compared with uranium fission and the early decrease in decay heat for MOX fuel will affect the analysis of loss of coolant accidents. Weapons-grade plutonium creates a harder neutron spectrum. Neutron energies could enhance the radiation damage of components. MOX fuel rods operate with higher centerline temperatures. Neutron damage could be accelerated. The diameter of fuel rods decreased. Pellet-to-cladding mechanical interactions increase. This NRC memo states that MOX fuel use makes reactor control more difficult, noting that the reduction in effectiveness of reactor control systems, which include control rods and control blades, is perhaps the most important technical issue that must be addressed. The NRC memo also notes there is less time for control rod insertion to provide reactor control. For fuel qualification in the Catawba reactor to proceed, Duke needed exemptions from certain licensing requirements, including exemptions to allow use of a zirconium alloy called M5, which was different than the zirconium alloys whose uses were allowed by regulations intended to ensure adequate safety margins in event of accidents. The Blue Ridge Environmental Defense League contended that Duke had not adequately assessed increased risks to the public posed by MOX fuel use, particularly in event of a loss of coolant accident, or LOCA. Some concerns were that fuel rod cladding deformation and ballooning and different microstructure and oxidation chemistry would increase the severity of accidents. Note that zirconium ballooning involves some of the same fundamental zirconium chemistry, microstructure, and texture that determine zirconium growth and bow deformations described in the previous part. Taking an unscientific, legalistic approach, The NRC appears to have introduced evidence supporting the MOX project into the licensing board's hearings that contained errors demonstrating the NRC's disregard or ignorance of fundamental zirconium properties, microstructure, and texture. To support a supposed NRC expert's rebuttal to other testimony describing hazards of the project, the NRC introduced as an exhibit a publication apparently intended to be regarded by the board as an authority on zirconium cladding tube deformation and core emergency cooling in Aloka that contained errors and inaccurate descriptions of zirconium cladding, microstructure, and geometry. Examination of the paper indicates that its introduction into evidence appears to either demonstrate NRC technical incompetence or to have amounted to a legal tactic to mislead the board or to provide NRC judges already inclined to allow the project to proceed with favorable evidence, rather than introduction of scientifically accurate information that might have guided the board to a responsible decision. The exhibit certainly supports the MOX project, claiming to summarize the dominant effects which finally ensure core coolability in Aloka, and concluding that it can be assumed that the safety of the population is fully guaranteed in event of a loss of coolant accident, presenting optimistic projections that the later 2011 loss of coolant accidents at Fukushima suggest were delusional speculation. While the NRC did not yet have the lessons learned from the later 2011 Fukushima loss of coolant accidents, in view of their 1999 memo, the NRC should have been aware of obvious problems with their exhibit. The paper was dated. It was 18 years old at the time of the hearing, and the paper itself was a review of earlier work. More recent advancements in understanding zirconium performance and shortcomings in nuclear reactors that were described in their 1999 memo were not covered in the paper. The paper did not even mention one more recently developed zirconium cladding alloy actually used in the MOX project, called M5. Descriptions of most of the paper's technical shortcomings, which an expert should have recognized, are beyond the scope of this short presentation, which is intended for those with limited backgrounds in metallurgy. But a few of the paper's more simple errors that demonstrate the author's misunderstanding of zirconium metallurgy and calls competence to describe cladding tube deformation into question might be recognized by even a grade school student. Third graders are taught to recognize hexagonal prism shapes. The NRC authority describes hexagonal prism-shaped crystals in zirconium fuel rod cladding. These are typical zirconium fuel rod cladding crystals, magnified thousands of times. They are sometimes called crystallites or grains because of their small sizes. Metallurgists describe their shapes as irregular or acicular. They are not hexagonal prism-shaped crystals. These are hexagonal prism-shaped crystals from non-nuclear materials. They are not zirconium cladding crystals. An expert would know that while these types of zirconium cladding have hexagonal atomic arrangements, also called hexagonal close-packed crystal structures, cladding crystallites are not hexagonal prism-shaped. And any expert would know that because of the manufacturing processes, significant levels of hexagonal prism-shaped crystals in these types of cladding are not possible, and would recognize that the statement in the NRC exhibit is wrong. While the NRC exhibit does correctly note that this deformation behavior of zirconium tubes is caused by the texture produced in the cladding tube fabrication in the hexagonal densely packed structure, understanding the difference between hexagonal crystal structures and hexagonal prism crystal shapes is important. And engineers confused about the difference who assumed that cladding was composed of hexagonal prism-shaped crystals could be seriously misled if attempting to design and manufacture zirconium cladding or create computer code to predict cladding tube deformation and failures during accidents, because irradiation growth and deformations of zirconium-based alloys depend on crystal shapes as well as crystal structures, that is, atomic arrangements. The wrong shape mistake is bad because hexagonal prism-shaped zirconium crystals do not occur in significant levels in the cladding described, but at least hexagonal prism-shaped zirconium crystals do exist in other materials. However, another error in the same sentence describes a cladding geometry that does not and cannot exist. It is neither physically nor conceptually possible. The NRC authority states that the hexagonal prism-shaped crystals have their prism planes oriented parallel to the cross-sectional plane of the cladding tube. This would be impossible for any hexagonal prism-shaped crystal, in the cladding or elsewhere, real or imagined. Any single plane, including a tube's cross-sectional plane, can only be parallel to, at most, 2 prism planes of each hexagonal prism-shaped crystal at any given time, if they existed. In that case, 4 of the 6 prism planes must intersect the 2 prism planes parallel to the cross-sectional plane, and therefore, at least 4 of the prism planes must intersect the cross-sectional plane itself. That is, all 6 hexagonal prism planes cannot be oriented parallel to any single plane at the same time. This is fundamental geometry taught in grade school. While simple, this is not a trivial misunderstanding. Understanding that 4 of 6 hexagonal prism planes are not parallel to a tube's cross-sectional plane is important to understanding temperature, chemistry, and irradiation-induced movements of the hexagonally arranged zirconium atoms that cause zirconium fuel rod cladding to grow, bow, deform, and sometimes balloon in reactors. One might wonder, where do these types of misunderstandings come from? If one searches the NRC website for zirconium texture, one might come across a couple of Department of Energy publications containing this diagram, as well as papers that reference publications containing this type of diagram. These types of mistakes might have been made if the paper's author misunderstood this type of diagram. Because it's important to understand the relationships of the geometries of zirconium atomic arrangements and the tubes that they compose, scientists sometimes use these types of diagrams as a kind of map showing directions of atomic arrangements in zirconium tubes. This hexagonal prism intends to show that hexagonal atomic arrangements tend to orient in certain directions in the cladding tubes, not crystal shapes. The hexagonal prism indicates that crystallographic directions, not the presence of hexagonal prism-shaped crystals in cladding. The paper's error about parallel planes might also be understood if this type of diagram was misinterpreted. A hexagonal prism has 3 pairs of parallel prism planes for a total of 6 prism planes. In the diagram, only one of the 6 prism planes needed to be labeled to describe all of the crystallographic directions adequately. The diagram assumes that anyone using it would then understand orientations of the other prism planes in the other crystallographic directions. But if one failed to understand that the diagram needed to label only one of the 6 hexagonal prism planes and 2 other types of prism planes must also exist, and their directions are fixed because of the hexagonal prism geometry and symmetry, one might misinterpret that label as showing that a cladding crystal has only one type of prism plane, and mistakenly state that the alloy prism planes are oriented parallel to the cross-sectional plane of the cladding tube, as the NRC exhibit did. This is not as unreasonable as it may sound, because hexagonal crystals have only one type of basal plane, called the OO2, as the diagram does accurately show. The hexagonal prism in the diagram is intended to show how atomic arrangements and directions relate to part shapes, much like a compass rose is printed on a world map to show locations in different countries, needing only to be labeled with one letter, N, to show directions relative to land shapes. To use a map properly, one must understand that In addition to north, the directions south, east, and west also exist. Compass roses on maps like this show that an island called Ireland can be found by sailing west of the larger island called Great Britain. However, one cannot sail further west of Ireland and find a large compass rose with 4 points on the ocean, where it's shown on the map. The compass rose is shown on the diagram to show directions, not the physical existence of 4 arrows west of Ireland. And if a navigator gets confused by what a compass rose on a map shows, he probably shouldn't be navigating and guiding ships. And most people familiar with maps understand all of this. Similarly, one can find tubes that look like this diagram in the real world. And one can use this diagram to understand how the hexagonal arrangements of zirconium atoms tend to be directed relative to the cladding tube, to determine how atoms might move and settle after neutron collisions, and to predict how cladding might grow, deform, and break when subjected to various forces in a reactor. If the diagram is accurate, the hexagonal atomic arrangements and crystallographic directions are real and can be verified with the right instruments. But one will not see the hexagonal prism-shaped crystals, or arrows, like those shown in the diagram. It appears possible that the author of the NRC's exhibit might have misinterpreted a diagram like this. An expert in cladding tube behavior who carefully read this paper and understood the realities of real-world cladding should have recognized the geometry errors and other problems with this exhibit. This mix of grade school geometry and college-level chemistry might confuse someone unfamiliar with zirconium cladding alloys and fuel rod geometry. In describing the details of the implications of the mistake and the specific misunderstandings that could arise from errors like this could get pretty complicated. But should those confused about zirconium alloys be writing papers on zirconium fuel rod cladding deformations determined by zirconium crystal structures and geometry? And should the NRC be introducing confused papers with those types of errors as exhibits into hearings? The NRC introduced those errors in hearings to guide judicial decisions about relicensing that allowed tests and experiments of new designs whose safety depends on understanding those cladding deformations and maintaining nuclear core cooling geometry. Did the NRC introduce these errors into any of their accident modeling computer codes? Did the NRC miss these types of errors in the computer models that they approved?
This DOE diagram, found in publications on the NRC website, contains yet another type of wrong-way error. Records reviewed to this point do not demonstrate that the diagram appeared in any exhibits in the MOX hearing. However, because publications were prepared for the Division of Reactor Safety Research of the NRC by the Department of Energy, the lead government agency responsible for the MOX project, and the publications are posted on the NRC website as NUREGs, and could very well have influenced the thinking of those in the NRC and nuclear industry responsible for designs of zirconium cladding, fuel assembly parts, control rod guide tubes, and fuel channels that deformed when taken to high burnups and their influence on emergency planning. The error is worth a brief review.
The diagram attempts to show 30-degree angular misorientations between the submicroscopic atomic arrangements and the cladding tube wall. But if one looks closely at the diagram, one can see that the DOE figure actually shows the misorientation directions relative to the cladding center, not the cladding wall, and appears to indicate that there is a 0-degree misorientation between the cladding wall and the cladding crystal structures. That is, the cladding wall and cladding crystal structures are aligned. This diagram from an OECD publication accurately shows that the misorientation directions are relative to the wall, not the cladding center. The OECD diagram shows the right starting point at the cladding wall. The DOE diagram is like giving the wrong starting point when giving directions. If you start in France and go west to find Ireland, you won't find it. Because of the wrong starting point, you went the wrong way. Unlike the DOE figure, the OECD diagram also clearly shows that, due to symmetry, the crystallographic directions go both ways. Their diagram shows this with drawings of two hexagonal prisms, each pointing in a different direction. While failing to include the two orientations in the DOE publication might be viewed as a practical simplification rather than an error of omission, understanding that two equivalent types of atomic arrangements tend to occur in many thousands of crystallites in this type of cladding is important to understanding zirconium growth and deformation. And in any event, in accurately showing the misorientation relative to the wrong starting point, the center, is certainly an error. Note that the DOE ran the MOX fuel qualification project requiring use of NRC-approved fuel cladding, fuel assemblies, and nuclear accident computer modeling codes. And, as described in more detail later, reports indicate that MOX fuel cladding unexpectedly bowed and excessive growth of MOX fuel assemblies approved by the NRC required a redesign of the Duke reactor to remove them after only 2 of 3 planned fuel cycles. Fortunately, to date, the accident computer modeling codes approved by the NRC have not yet been put to the test. NRC staff rebuttal testimony cited the flawed paper. In describing cladding crystal structures, deformation, ballooning, and ruptures, information from the paper was used to support speculative statements about temperatures, causes, and conditions creating cladding deformation, bursting, rupture, and ballooning. Note that the testimony was significant because an accurate understanding of conditions causing ballooning, rupture, and bursting of cladding is necessary to prepare accurate computer models that would be relied on to determine reactor conditions and to decide if and when evacuation of surrounding communities would be necessary in event of an accident. The NRC Licensing Board decision allowed Duke to proceed with the MOX project. Much of the hearing record leading up to the decision is unavailable. Some of the evidence appears to be hidden by protective orders and claims of proprietary information, so it's difficult to describe the proceedings. But available information indicates that the hearings were not guided by the consideration of sound scientific and engineering facts and principles. The hearings appear to be more like an exercise in information manipulation. Lawyers and judges appear to have exploited hearing rules to selectively control introduction of information, some of it false and nonsense, into evidence to provide a veneer of science to NRC staff evidence and arguments formulated to bring their targeted outcomes. In arguments against allowing petitioner participation in the licensing hearings and the introduction of their evidence into the record, the NRC staff questioned the extent to which petitioners' participation was expected to assist in developing a sound record. The extent to which NRC staff participation in introduction of a paper containing wrong way, wrong shape, and other technically inaccurate information assisted in developing a sound record is not mentioned in the available documents. One ruling appears to allow the judges to avoid addressing some radiation protection issues on the grounds that one contention impermissibly attacks the Commission's regulations and policies because petitioners failed to meet the stringent requirements of certain regulations. The Commission also advised that a petitioner had an ironclad obligation to examine the publicly available documentary material pertaining to the facility in question with sufficient care to enable the petitioner to uncover any information that could serve as the foundation for a specific contention. This obligation could be viewed as impractical due to the overwhelming amount of publicly available material and the fact that some of it is technically inaccurate, and due to the circumstances in which the petitioner's ability to evaluate that information was impaired, as the NRC sought to deny the petitioner access to sensitive information that might have enabled the petitioner
to recognize the significance of some publicly available materials.
Given the consequences of nuclear technology gone wrong, shouldn't the NRC, in its regulatory role, have an ironclad obligation to disclose any information that the NRC is aware of supporting contentions and issues raised, even if introduction of that information into evidence is detrimental to the NRC's targeted outcomes? The NRC appears to have acted as a less than forthcoming and maybe even a dishonest advocate for the MOX experiment in adversarial proceedings. The NRC's support of the MOX project appears to have been effective and successful from a legal perspective, even if misleading, deceitful, and incompetent from a scientific perspective. As it had done in the past and would do in the future, the NRC demonstrated that in hearings, judges regarded NRC staff to be a competent and honest technical authority, which aided the NRC's staff ability to deceive judges and manipulate decisions.
Given the hazardous nature of nuclear power and the impact of accidents, common sense might indicate that the realities of chemistry and physics should have determined which technical issues were considered in the licensing hearing, not artificially imposed hearing rules and regulations.
It took only 2 of the 3 planned fuel cycles in the MOX fuel qualification project to see the effects of the NRC misunderstandings of zirconium microstructure and texture demonstrated by their introduction of highly flawed exhibits and their failure to pursue inaccurate technical information on the performance of the zirconium fuel cladding and fuel assemblies that the NRC approved for use in Duke's reactors for the MOX project.
Shouldn't the content of evidentiary records in these types of legal proceedings be determined by the science rather than clever lawyers and their manipulations of hearing rules? It's as if secretaries were allowed to exclude information from hearing records by cutting off parts of documents so that they fit into their 8.5 by 11-inch file folders. Both hearing rules and secretarial practices have considerable value in collecting and organizing information and evidence for legal proceedings and decisions. However, like secretarial practices, the legal process should serve the science in the decision-making process, not the other way around. Too often in this and other cases, nullification of science by hearing rules appear to produce ridiculous nonsense and unexpected failures.
Accidents are governed by the laws of science and nature, and judicial rulings or regulations often cannot stop them. In 2005, Duke inserted MOX fuel test assemblies into their Catawba reactor. In 2006, Duke indicated that they would complete 3 cycles of MOX fuel test assembly use by fall of 2009. The first 2 cycles were required for fuel qualification. The 3rd cycle was to determine the effects of taking fuels to higher burnups. Note that information from the 3rd cycle would have been particularly useful in understanding fuel behavior in ALOCA or other accidents.
After only 2 of the 3 fuel cycles were completed, a 2008 news report indicated that Duke halted the MOX testing at Catawba. Duke removed MOX fuel assemblies. Zirconium alloy guide tubes in the MOX fuel assemblies, in which control rods are inserted to shut down the reactor, grew more than expected. Guide tube growth was seen in other reactors fueled with conventional fuel. Areva built the fuel assemblies. The Nuclear National Security Administration, the Department of Energy agency in charge of the MOX program, stated that it didn't expect the testing halt to derail its schedule. A June 2008 Duke report to the NRC stated that a redesign of the core was required to remove the MOX fuel assemblies from the core due to excessive assembly growth.
A 2009 news report stated Duke Energy won't do more MOX tests. After the 2nd fuel cycle, some abnormalities were noted in the fuel rods. Abnormalities included unexpected expansion of the rods and some bowing. Government officials reportedly indicated that the abnormalities had nothing to do with the fuel being MOX, and that conventional uranium fuels are known to have similar conditions, seemingly dismissing the unexpected fuel expansion in Boeing as something that happens from time to time. Although these conditions have occurred to a lesser extent with conventional uranium fuels and at high burnups, in view of the NRC's 1999 memo stating that weapons-grade plutonium creates a harder neutron spectrum. Neutron energies could enhance the radiation damage of components. Neutron damage could be accelerated, and MOX fuel rods operate with higher centerline temperatures, or statements indicating that Boeing, growth, and abnormalities had nothing to do with the fuel being MOX, accurate and honest. Areva reviewed unexpected zirconium deformations that occurred in their M5 fuel rods, fuel assemblies, control rod guide tubes, and fuel channels that occurred during the MOX project and in many conventionally fueled reactors with the NRC. Unfortunately, many details are unavailable because many of the slides posted on the NRC website are nearly blank. But from one slide on unexpected guide tube growth, one can see that understanding chemistry, microstructure, which includes crystal shapes, and texture were important to understanding the growth and deformations. Did failures to understand zirconium texture, wrong information not pursued or reviewed objectively, mistakes in DOL publications prepared for the NRC, mistakes in NRC exhibits introduced into hearings, and who knows where else, contribute to poor designs and poor decisions about operations, and lead to unexpected zirconium distortions in components designed and manufactured by Areva and other major industry suppliers. Some reports of the MOX project were positive. While not describing inaccurate technical information introduced into the relicensing hearing record by the NRC, the Electric Power Research Institute dismissed the assembly growth issues as not related to MOX, noting that the MOX fuel performance testing was considered successful. In keeping with the nuclear industry's tendency to use nautical terms when describing their nuclear fleet, one news report accused opponents of MOX fuel tests of issuing deceptive statements and wrote that statements that the Duke MOX fuel tests were a failure are like icebergs. They tell one part, their story, which is visible above the water. What they don't tell you is that another 7 parts of facts are also part of the picture. It's difficult to determine exactly what was said and what happened because some links were removed. But as the MOX project sailed on, more parts of the MOX picture emerged. Before the MOX fuel fabrication plant could be completed, fraud, delays, and fines threatened the MOX project, which was already more than $3 billion over budget and years behind schedule. In 2014, the MOX project was described as botched, and the DOE announced that it would place the MOX project on cold standby, mothballing the project for the foreseeable future, suggesting that the unexpected zirconium deformations of NRC-approved fuel rods, fuel channels, control rod guide tubes, and other components of fuel assemblies were just an early iceberg contributing to the DOE's Titanic success of sinking billions of taxpayer dollars in a boondoggle that only benefited those well-positioned to profit from this fiasco. At the end of 2016, the window of opportunity to dispose of tons of weapons-grade plutonium appears to have been closed. The plutonium remains an existential threat to humanity, although it's quite possible that technical misunderstandings may have produced a worse outcome had the MOX project been allowed to proceed. A search of the NRC website shows that the publication with the wrong way and wrong shape errors that was used by the NRC is cited elsewhere, including citations in supplemental information to licensing amendment requests and computer models of boiling water reactor emergency core cooling systems. The records make it difficult to see how the paper was used, but one can only wonder if communities might become wrong-way parachute testers for unproven computer code in event of an accident.
While Congress has held hearings on MOX fuel production problems, the NRC's corrupted information practices and their detrimental effects on judicial proceedings, current industry practices, and public safety do not seem to have been recognized and addressed. In fact, more recent NRC regulatory activity based on bad science appears to exempt industry from responsible conduct.
This presentation has focused on just a few of many important materials failures in nuclear reactors that are easy to understand and are documented in publicly available records. Some of the others will be described in future parts of zirconium errors and hazards in the nuclear industry when resources permit it. But there are far too many problems and failures to describe in a comprehensible way. Bad technical information caused by irresponsible, incompetent, and corrupt information practices in the nuclear industry and NRC are at the root of other materials failures like those found at Indian Point, which hopefully will be closing and be cleaned up in the near future before a serious accident occurs. If you know that hexagonal prisms look like this, and if you know that wrong way errors confirmed by the NRC are the wrong way to go, you are technically qualified to make the judgment that the NRC presented technically inaccurate information in court, which allowed industry operations that led to unexpected zirconium failures.
Please consider contacting your government officials and asking them to demand that the NRC and industry maintain accurate technical information.
Congressional offices actually want to hear your opinion on important issues, and every call helps justify and gain support for action. Call now before another nuclear failure brings radiation into your community and threatens the health of you and your family.